It's simply not true. It should never be broadcast at all. They've exaggerated and they've added whole sections.
Welcome to part 2 of our series separating fact from fiction in season 5 of The Crown. In this instalment, the Mail's Richard Eden returns to help break down the truth behind some of the most popular and controversial plot points. One of the most popular episodes shows Mohamed Fayed hiring Sydney Johnson as his butler after learning he used to work for the Duke of Windsor. Caribbean-born Sydney teaches Fayed how to be a proper English gentleman after years of working for Edward. And, unlike much of the rest of the series, this plotline is mostly true. When Edward was governor of the Bahamas in the 1940s, he hired 16-year-old Sydney to work in his household. The young Bahamian obviously made an impact because he relocated with the Duke to Paris and served him for 30 years during his exile. Sydney was among the few people at Edward's funeral service in 1972 and was left $30,000 in his will. But he appears to have fallen out with Wallis Simpson after the Duke's death, and this is how he came to be working at the Ritz, where he caught Fayed's eye.
Generally, The Crown it's a very sympathetic portrayal of Mohamed Fayed. You know, he's a dubious character really, so he'll probably be very pleased with his portrayal. The essential truth is that the butler, Sydney Johnson, worked for the Duke of Windsor, started working for him when he was in the Bahamas and came back and worked for him again in Paris for 30 years. And then Mohamed Fayed sort of used him to help him become an English gentleman really, giving him all sorts of advice on what to wear, how to behave. And the story of Sydney Johnson is one that's well worth hearing, I think. So basically true.
Episodes 7 and 8 of The Crown are dedicated to Princess Diana's 1995 Panorama interview about the breakdown of her marriage to Charles. However, while the drama correctly depicts Martin Bashir as using deceit to gain the interview, it does exaggerate and fabricate Diana's words. It condenses and exaggerates the most inflammatory accusations against Charles.
It is welcomed that the BBC accepts Lord Dyson's findings in full, which are extremely concerning. That BBC employees lied and used fake documents to obtain the interview with my mother, made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia, displayed woeful incompetence when investigating complaints and concerns about the programme, and were evasive in their reporting to the media and covered up what they knew from their internal investigation. It is my view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what my mother said.
Prince William has already made a plea for the interview never to be aired again, saying it played on his mother's fears and fueled her paranoia.
Prince William made clear he didn't want this to be broadcast. He didn't want the original footage of the interview to be shown, and here we have Netflix recreating it. But what's worse is they haven't recreated it accurately. They've exaggerated and they've added whole sections. For example, there's one where she's asked about the effect of her marriage breakdown on her children, and she talks about its effect on William. Well, there was none of that in the original interview, so it's particularly misleading and questionable as to why they've done that.
One of the scenes that has caused the most controversy comes in episode 7 when Diana is shown struggling to use her car brakes. "I think they fiddled with the brakes on my car," she later says to her brother Charles Spencer, after he reveals journalist Martin Bashir believes the British security services and Buckingham Palace are watching the princess. It is an obvious reference to conspiracy theories surrounding Diana's death when her car crashed in Paris.
This is one of the most alarming scenes in The Crown because it's simply not true. There's no evidence that the brakes of her car were ever tampered with. And what it's doing is trying to illustrate her fears at the time. You know, Diana feared that her brakes might be tampered with, and she said that. You know, on the record that's known. But as far as we know, they never were. Although my colleague Richard Kay has pointed out that she was involved in a 3-car crash that was worrying at the time, but there was no suggestion that it was to do with the brakes.
Episode 6 of The Crown shows King George V refusing to help rescue his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, and the rest of the Romanov family from the Russian Revolution in 1917. The Romanov children are shown being roused from their beds, believing they are being rescued by the British, but they are imprisoned and ultimately brutally executed by the Bolsheviks. Once again, the events depicted here are mostly true, and a British offer to rescue the Romanovs was rescinded over fears it would fuel republicanism in Britain.
This is a fascinating and horrendous episode to watch, and it is largely true. It was a very difficult time. We'd had 4 years of war. There was strong anti-German feeling. The Tsar of Russia, his wife Alexandra, was German-born, had strong German sympathies. There was a lot of nerves in the British establishment about the Russian Revolution. Could that happen here as well? And the Tsar and his wife were very unpopular, particularly with the working classes. So it wasn't a popular move. And the same month that they were massacred, the royal family here decided to change its name. It had the German name, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and that was changed to Windsor. And that was a sign of how strongly they felt about it. So it was a great source of shame and regret later, really, that they hadn't helped their cousins more.
In the 10th episode, Charles meets with Tony Blair, and the show suggests that the prince is conspiring against the Queen. Earlier episodes showed the prince lobbying John Major to persuade the Queen to abdicate. Blair tells his wife Cherie it was pretty gobsmacking what he was doing, effectively briefing against his own mother. However, both Sir John and Sir Tony have since slammed this storyline as complete and utter rubbish.
So Tony Blair has made clear that this didn't happen at all. He's actually put out a statement on the record to make that clear. He said it's all fiction. It's a good story, you know, it really sort of adds to the drama, but it is giving a very misleading version of events, that there's been both Prime Ministers, both Blair and Sir John Major, sort of conspiring with Charles really to undermine the Queen, and that never happened, so very much false.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe for more.